The helicopter blades cut through the desert air, like angry metal wasps as the medical transport touched down at forward. Operating Base Alpha, sand swirled in thick clouds around the landing zone, forcing everyone to shield their eyes and turn away. Through the chaos, a figure emerged from the aircraft's belly, moving with purpose despite the storm of dust and debris. Dr. Sarah Martinez stepped onto the rough concrete, her medical bag clutched tightly in one hand and a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She was smaller than most people expected a combat medic to be, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her olive-green uniform was crisp and clean, marking her as fresh arrival to this dusty corner of Afghanistan. The base commander, Colonel Williams, approached her with a firm handshake. His weathered face showed years of desert deployments, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from sending too many young soldiers into harm's way. "Welcome to Alpha, Doc," he shouted over the helicopter noise. "We've been waiting for you." Sarah nodded, her expression serious but calm. She had trained for this moment for 3 years, ever since she made the decision to leave her comfortable position at a civilian hospital in San Diego, the transition from treating car accident victims and heart attack patients to battlefield trauma had been intense, but she felt ready. At least, she hoped she was ready. As they walked toward the main compound, Colonel Williams briefed her on the situation. The base housed approximately 400 personnel, including 2 SEAL teams that conducted regular operations in the surrounding mountains. The previous medic had been injured in an IED explosion 2 weeks earlier and evacuated back to Germany. Since then, they had been operating with minimal medical support. "The men are good soldiers," the colonel explained as they passed rows of prefabricated buildings and defensive barriers. "But they've been through a lot lately. We lost 3 guys last month, and morale isn't what it should be. They might take some time to warm up to you." Sarah understood what he meant without him having to spell it out. She was not only the new medic, but also a woman in a predominantly male environment. She had faced similar challenges before, though never in a combat zone, where trust could literally mean the difference between life and death. The medical facility was larger than she had expected, with multiple treatment rooms, a small surgical suite, and enough supplies to handle serious trauma cases. Her living quarters were modest but functional, a small room with a cot, a desk, and a locker for her personal belongings. It was not much, but it would do. That evening, Sarah made her way to the dining facility for her first meal on the base. The large tent was filled with the sounds of conversation and clinking utensils, but she noticed how the noise seemed to drop a few decibels when she entered. Dozens of eyes followed her as she moved through the serving line. Collecting portions of what appeared to be some kind of stew and bread, she found an empty table near the back and sat down alone, focusing on her food while trying to ignore the stares. It was not unexpected, but it still felt uncomfortable. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle such situations was to remain professional and let her work speak for itself. A group of men at a nearby table were talking loudly enough for her to overhear their conversation. They wore the same desert uniforms as everyone else, but something about their bearing and the way they carried themselves suggested they were special operations. Their discussion centered around an upcoming mission, and she caught fragments about extraction points and target identification. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and intense blue eyes, glanced in her direction several times. When their eyes met briefly, he did not look away immediately like the others had been doing. Instead, he studied her with the kind of assessment she had come to recognize in military personnel. They were trying to figure out if she could be trusted when things went bad. After dinner, Sarah returned to the medical facility to familiarize herself with the equipment and supplies. She was checking the inventory of surgical instruments when she heard voices outside. Through the window, she could see a group of men gathered around a picnic table, some smoking cigarettes and others drinking coffee from metal cups. "I'm telling you, she looks like she's never seen anything worse than a scraped knee," one of them was saying. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had been in combat multiple times. Give her a chance, Rodriguez, another voice replied, though it lacked conviction. Maybe she knows what she's doing. Sarah continued her inventory, pretending not to hear the conversation. She had expected this kind of skepticism and knew that proving herself would take time. What concerned her more was the possibility that their doubts might hesitate them from seeking medical attention when they needed it most, the next morning brought. Her first real test? She was organizing medical supplies when the alarm sounded throughout the base. The sharp, piercing wail meant incoming casualties, and Sarah felt her heart rate spike as training took over. She quickly prepared the treatment areas, laying out trauma supplies and ensuring that all equipment was ready for immediate use. The first helicopter arrived within 20 minutes, and Sarah positioned herself outside the medical facility as the crew chiefs began unloading stretchers. The first patient was conscious and talking, with what appeared to be shrapnel wounds to his leg. The second was unconscious, with a head injury that had already soaked through multiple bandages. As the medical team worked to bring the casualties inside, Sarah noticed that several SEALs had gathered nearby, watching her every move. Their scrutiny was intense and obvious, and she realized this was more than curiosity. They were evaluating her competence under pressure, determining whether they could trust her with their lives. The conscious patient was a young soldier, probably not more than 20 years old, and he was scared. Sarah knelt beside his stretcher and spoke to him in a calm, reassuring voice while she examined his wounds. "You're going to be fine," she told him, and she meant it. The shrapnel had missed any major blood vessels or bones. The unconscious patient required more immediate attention. Sarah quickly assessed his condition and determined that he needed surgery to relieve pressure on his brain. As she prepared for the procedure, she was acutely aware of the SEALs, watching from the doorway of the medical facility. Working with steady hands and complete focus, Sarah performed the emergency surgery while her assistant monitored the patient's vital signs. The procedure required precision and confidence, two qualities that could not be faked under such circumstances. As she worked, the watching soldiers gradually began to disperse, apparently satisfied with what they had seen. Both patients stabilized successfully, and by evening they were resting comfortably. Sarah completed her paperwork and cleaned the medical facility, feeling cautiously optimistic about her first day of operations. She had handled the situation competently, and perhaps that would be enough to begin earning the trust of the men she was there to protect. 3 weeks had passed since Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived at Forward Operating Base Alpha, and she was beginning to find her rhythm in the demanding environment. The initial skepticism from the soldiers had softened somewhat, replaced by a cautious acceptance based on her competent handling of several medical emergencies. However, she still felt like an outsider looking in, particularly when it came to the tight-knit SEAL teams. The morning started like any other, with Sarah conducting her routine equipment checks and reviewing patient files. The 2 soldiers from her first day had recovered well and been evacuated to a larger medical facility in Germany. Since then, she had treated everything from training injuries to food poisoning, but nothing that truly tested her abilities under extreme pressure. Around 10 o'clock, the base communication system crackled to life with an urgent message. SEAL Team Bravo was requesting immediate extraction from a mountainous region about 40 miles north of the base. They had 1 man down with serious injuries, and their original extraction point had been compromised by enemy activity. Colonel Williams appeared in the medical facility within minutes, his expression grim. "Doc, we've got a situation," he said without preamble. "One of our SEALs took a round to the chest during a reconnaissance mission. They managed to get him stable, but he needs surgery within the next few hours or we're going to lose him." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with critical situations. "What's the plan for extraction?" she asked, already moving toward her medical supplies. "That's the problem," Williams replied. "The regular extraction point is hot with enemy fighters. We can get them out, but it's going to be a rough ride, and our injured man might not survive the trip back here." Sarah paused in her preparations, understanding the implication immediately. "You want me to go in with the rescue team?" "It's not standard procedure," the colonel admitted. But you're the only one here qualified to perform the kind of surgery he needs. Our medics are good, but this is beyond their training level. The decision was not difficult for Sarah. She had joined the military to save lives, and this soldier's life depended on her willingness to leave the relative safety of the base. "I'll go," she said simply, within an hour. Sarah found herself strapped into the belly of a Black Hawk helicopter, her medical bag secured beside her and her stomach, churning from both nervousness and the aircraft's turbulent flight pattern. The crew chief, a veteran sergeant named Thompson, kept up a running commentary about the mission parameters and potential hazards they might encounter. "The landing zone is about 2 clicks from the SEAL position," Thompson shouted over the engine noise. "We'll be on the ground for 15 minutes maximum. After that, we risk drawing too much attention from unfriendly forces in the area." Sarah nodded, checking her medical supplies one more time. She had packed everything she might need for emergency surgery, including portable surgical instruments, blood products, and anesthetic medications. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than her. Equipment. The helicopter began its descent toward a rocky plateau surrounded by steep mountain faces. Through the small window, Sarah could see the rugged terrain that made Afghanistan such a challenging place to conduct military operations. Every ridge and valley could hide enemy fighters, and the isolation made medical evacuation extremely complicated. As soon as the aircraft touched down, Sarah was moving. The SEAL team had established a defensive perimeter around their injured teammate, and she could see them spread out among the rocks, their weapons pointed outward. The wounded man lay on a makeshift stretcher in the center of their position, with one of his teammates applying pressure to a bandage on his chest. Sarah reached the patient and immediately began her assessment. The injured SEAL was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. The bullet had entered his chest just below the left shoulder, and based on his symptoms, she suspected it had caused significant internal damage. His name tag read Phillips, and he looked young, probably in his mid-20s. "How long has he been unconscious?" Sarah asked the medic who had been treating him. "About 20 minutes, came the reply. "He was talking when it first happened, but he's been getting worse." Sarah listened to Phillips's chest with her stethoscope and confirmed her initial diagnosis. The bullet had likely caused a collapsed lung and possible damage to major blood vessels. Without immediate surgery, he would not survive the flight back to base. "I need to operate here," she announced to the team leader, a grizzled sergeant named Morrison. "He won't make it back to base in this condition." Morrison looked skeptical. "Doc, this isn't exactly a sterile environment. We're in the middle of enemy territory with minimal security." "I understand the risks," Sarah replied, already unpacking her surgical instruments. "But if we don't do this now, he dies anyway." The next hour tested every skill Sarah had learned in medical school and military training. Working on the rocky ground with minimal lighting and the constant threat of enemy attack, she performed emergency surgery to repair Phillips's damaged lung and control internal bleeding. The other SEALs maintained their defensive positions, occasionally reporting movement in the surrounding hills. Despite the challenging conditions, Sarah's hands remained steady as she worked. She had trained for situations like this, though she had never imagined her first battlefield surgery would take place on a mountain plateau in Afghanistan. The portable surgical kit provided everything she needed, and Phillips's vital signs gradually stabilized as she repaired the damage. "How much longer, Doc?" Morrison asked, his voice tense with concern about their tactical situation. "Almost finished," Sarah replied, placing the final sutures. "He should be stable enough for transport now." As she packed up her instruments, Phillips began to regain consciousness. His eyes opened slowly, and he looked around in confusion before focusing on Sarah's face. "Who are you?" he whispered weakly. "I'm Dr. Martinez," Sarah replied, checking his pulse one more time. "You're going to be fine, but we need to get you back to base for proper treatment." The flight back to base passed without incident, though Sarah remained focused on monitoring Phillips's condition throughout the journey. By the time they landed at Alpha, his vital signs had improved significantly, and she was confident he would make a full recovery. News of the successful mission spread quickly through the base. And Sarah noticed a change in how the other soldiers looked at her. The skeptical glances had been replaced by something that looked like respect. And several people she had never spoken to before nodded in acknowledgement when they passed her in the corridors. That evening, Sergeant Morrison appeared at the medical facility. "Doc, I wanted to thank you for what you did today," he said. "Phillips has a wife and 2 kids back home. You saved more than just his life." Sarah accepted his gratitude with a modest nod, but she could see something else in Morrison's expression. There was curiosity there, and perhaps a new willingness to see her as more than just the replacement medic. She sensed that her actions on the mountain had begun to change how the SEALs viewed her capabilities, though she suspected the real test was yet to come. The weeks following the mountain rescue mission had transformed. Dr. Sarah Martinez is standing at Forward Operating Base, Alpha, where once there had been suspicious glances and whispered doubts. She now received respectful nods and genuine greetings from soldiers throughout the base. Her successful surgery under enemy fire had proven her competence beyond question, and the SEALs who had initially questioned her abilities now sought her out for routine medical needs. However, Sarah noticed that despite their growing professional respect, the elite operators still maintained an emotional distance. They would trust her with their physical wounds, but she sensed deeper injuries that remained carefully hidden beneath their tough exteriors. It was a wall she recognized from her civilian practice, though it seemed thicker and more deliberately constructed among these battle-hardened warriors. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, the team leader from the mountain mission, had become her most frequent visitor. Initially, he came for follow-up checks on a minor shoulder injury, but his visits had become more regular and seemed to serve purposes beyond medical necessity. Sarah suspected he was conducting his own assessment of her capabilities, perhaps reporting back to his teammates about her trustworthiness. On a particularly quiet Tuesday morning, Morrison appeared at the medical facility with what he claimed was a headache. Sarah examined him thoroughly, finding no physical cause for his discomfort. But she noticed the tension in his jaw and the way his eyes seemed to focus on distant points rather than meeting her gaze directly. "How have you been sleeping?" she asked, making notes in his medical file. "Fine," Morrison replied automatically. The standard soldier response to any question about personal well-being. Sarah had heard that same answer dozens of times since arriving at the base. It was a reflexive response that revealed nothing while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. She decided to try a different approach. "Staff Sergeant, I've noticed that a lot of you guys have been dealing with headaches and sleep issues lately. It's pretty common in high-stress environments," she said, keeping her tone casual and non-judgmental. "Sometimes talking about what's causing the stress can help." Morrison's expression hardened slightly, and Sarah recognized the defensive walls going up. "With all due respect, Doc, I don't think you understand what we deal with out there." "You're probably right," Sarah admitted. "I've only been here a few weeks, and I've never been in direct combat. But I do know about trauma and how it affects people." For a moment, Morrison seemed to consider her words. Then he shook his head and stood up. "The headache's probably just the heat. Thanks for checking, Doc." After he left, Sarah reflected on the conversation. She had encountered similar resistance in her civilian practice, when treating police officers and firefighters who had experienced traumatic events. The culture of toughness and self-reliance that made these professionals effective in dangerous situations also made them reluctant to acknowledge psychological wounds. That afternoon, she received word that SEAL Team Alpha was returning from a 3-day mission in the Northern Valleys. Sarah prepared the medical facility for their arrival, knowing from experience that even routine missions often resulted in minor injuries that needed attention. What she did not expect was the condition of the team. When they arrived, the 6-man team entered the base looking exhausted beyond normal fatigue. Their faces were drawn and their movements mechanical, lacking the confident swagger she had come to associate with the elite operators. Team leader Chief Petty Officer Marcus Torres, a compact man with intelligent dark eyes, requested medical clearance for his entire team. During the individual examinations, Sarah noted that all 6 men displayed signs of acute stress. Their blood pressure readings were elevated, several complained of headaches or stomach problems, and none of them would maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds. When she asked about their mission, she received only vague responses about routine reconnaissance. The last team member to be examined was Petty Officer First Class Danny Rodriguez, a young Hispanic man who appeared to be in his early 20s. Unlike the others, he seemed agitated rather than withdrawn, and Sarah noticed a slight tremor in his hands when he thought she was not looking. "How are you feeling, Rodriguez?" she asked while checking his blood pressure. "I'm good, Doc, ready for the next mission," he replied. But his voice lacked conviction. Sarah finished her examination and began updating his medical records. It's normal to have strong reactions after difficult experiences," she said without looking up from her paperwork. "Sometimes talking about what happened can help process those feelings." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, and when Sarah looked up, she saw that his carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack. "We lost someone today," he said quietly. Sarah set down her pen and gave him her full attention. "I'm sorry. Do you want to tell me what happened?" "His name was Ahmed," Rodriguez continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was maybe 12 years old and he was trying to help us. Told us where the bad guys were hiding." Rodriguez paused, struggling with the words. "They killed him for it. Made us watch." Sarah felt her own chest tighten at the image Rodriguez's words created. She had treated the physical wounds of war, but this was her first direct exposure to its psychological casualties. That must have been incredibly difficult to witness. "The worst part is, there was nothing we could do," Rodriguez said. "We had to maintain our position, couldn't compromise the mission. So we just watched this kid die because he tried to help us." Tears began forming in Rodriguez's eyes, and Sarah could see him fighting to maintain control. The military culture demanded emotional toughness, especially from elite warriors like the SEALs, but she could see the human cost of that expectation. "It's okay to be affected by something like that," she said gently. "It would be concerning if you weren't upset by watching a child be murdered." "But I'm supposed to be tough," Rodriguez replied. "SEALs don't break down over stuff like this." Sarah leaned forward slightly, making sure she had his attention. "Rodriguez, being tough doesn't mean being immune to human emotion. It means continuing to function despite those emotions. And part of functioning is dealing with trauma in healthy ways." For the next hour, Sarah listened as Rodriguez described the mission and his feelings about what they had witnessed. She provided some basic counseling techniques for managing acute stress and encouraged him to continue talking with someone about his experiences. By the time he left the medical facility, some of the tension had left his shoulders. Word of her conversation with Rodriguez must have spread among the team, because over the next few days, other members of SEAL Team Alpha began making appointments for minor medical issues. Sarah recognized the pattern from her civilian practice. They were testing her, seeing if she could be trusted with their emotional vulnerabilities as well as their physical injuries. Each conversation revealed more about the psychological toll of their missions. Chief Torres spoke about the difficulty of making life-and-death decisions with limited information. Another team member, Petty Officer Wilson, described his struggle with survivor guilt after losing a close friend in a previous deployment. Gradually, Sarah began to understand the invisible wounds these men carried alongside their visible ones. However, she also noticed that her growing relationship with the SEALs was creating some tension with other personnel on the base. During meals in the dining facility, she overheard comments about her spending too much time with the prima donnas and neglecting regular soldiers. Some of the criticism came from jealousy, but Sarah realized that her focus on the special operations teams might be creating an appearance of favoritism. One evening, Colonel Williams approached her after dinner. "Doc, I've been hearing some feedback about your work with the SEAL teams," he said. "Nothing bad, just observations about how much time you're spending with them." Sarah understood the implication. "Sir, I'm treating all personnel equally. The SEALs have been dealing with some difficult missions lately, and they need additional support." "I'm not questioning your judgment," Williams replied. "But remember that morale across the entire base is important. We can't afford to have regular infantry feeling like they're getting second-class medical care. The colonel's point was valid, and Sarah knew she would need to find a balance between providing specialized care for the traumatized SEALs while maintaining her responsibilities to all base personnel. It was a challenge she had not anticipated, but one that would test her ability to serve everyone's needs effectively. The alarm pierced through the pre-dawn darkness at Forward Operating Base Alpha, jolting Dr. Sarah Martinez from her sleep. She had grown accustomed to the harsh sound over the past 2 months, but this alarm felt different somehow, more urgent, more desperate. As she quickly dressed and grabbed her medical bag, she could hear shouting voices and running feet outside her quarters. Sarah reached the medical facility just as the first helicopter was landing in the distance. Even from several hundred yards away, she could see that this was not a routine casualty evacuation. Multiple aircraft were inbound, and the base's emergency lighting system had been activated, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Colonel Williams appeared at her side, his face grim in the artificial light. "Doc, we've got multiple casualties incoming. SEAL Team Bravo hit an IED during a night operation. Early reports suggest at least 4 wounded, possibly more." Sarah felt her stomach drop. SEAL Team Bravo included several men she had grown to know well over the past weeks, including Staff Sergeant Morrison and Petty Officer Rodriguez. The thought of treating people she had developed personal relationships with added an emotional weight to the already challenging situation. "What's the ETA on the first birds?" she asked, forcing herself to focus on the immediate medical requirements. "First helicopter is landing now," Williams replied. "Second one is about 10 minutes behind." Sarah ran toward the landing zone, her medical bag bouncing against her leg with each step. As she approached the first helicopter, she could see the crew chiefs already beginning to unload stretchers. The first casualty was conscious and talking, always a good sign. But the second stretcher carried someone who was completely still. The conscious patient was Rodriguez, and his face lit up with relief when he saw Sarah approaching. "Doc, thank God you're here," he said, his voice tight with pain. "Morrison's in bad shape. He needs help fast." Sarah quickly assessed Rodriguez's condition. He had shrapnel wounds to his arms and legs, painful but not life-threatening. "You're going to be fine," she told him. "Where's Morrison?" Rodriguez pointed toward the second stretcher, and Sarah felt her heart skip when she saw Morrison's condition. He was unconscious, with severe burns covering much of his left side and what appeared to be a serious head injury. Blood had soaked through multiple bandages, and his breathing was labored and irregular. As the medical team moved Morrison into the treatment facility, Sarah began her assessment. The IED blast had caused multiple trauma injuries, including burns, shrapnel wounds, and probable internal bleeding. Most concerning was the head injury, which showed signs of increased intracranial pressure that could prove fatal if not addressed immediately. "I need to operate now," Sarah announced to her medical team. "Prep the surgical suite and get me 4 units of O-negative blood." As she scrubbed it in for surgery, Sarah could hear the second helicopter arriving with additional casualties. She forced herself to focus on Morrison, knowing that her medical team could handle the other injured soldiers. While she dealt with the most critical case, the next 3 hours tested every skill Sarah had learned in medical school and military training. Working under intense pressure, she performed emergency surgery to relieve the pressure on Morrison's brain and repair internal bleeding from shrapnel wounds. The procedure was complicated by his extensive burns, which made it difficult to find uninjured areas for surgical access throughout the surgery. Sarah was acutely aware of the other SEAL team members waiting outside the medical facility. She could see them through the windows, pacing back and forth or sitting with their heads in their hands. Their worry was palpable, and she knew that Morrison's survival would affect the entire team's morale and effectiveness. As dawn broke over the base, Sarah finally completed the surgery. Morrison's vital signs had stabilized, though he remained in critical condition. She emerged from the surgical suite exhausted, but cautiously optimistic about his chances for survival. The waiting SEALs immediately surrounded her, their faces showing a mixture of hope and fear. Chief Torres, who had flown in with the second helicopter despite his own minor injuries, stepped forward to speak for the group. "How is he, Doc?" Torres asked, his voice hoarse with fatigue and emotion. "He's alive, and his vital signs are stable," Sarah replied. "The next 24 hours will be critical, but I think he's going to make it." She could see the relief wash over the assembled men, followed quickly by something else, a depth of gratitude that went beyond professional appreciation. In that moment, Sarah realized that she had crossed an invisible threshold in her relationship with these warriors. She was no longer just their medic. She had become someone they trusted with their most precious commodity, each other's lives, over the next several days. As Morrison slowly recovered consciousness and began the long process of healing, Sarah noticed a fundamental change in how the SEALs interacted with her. The professional distance they had maintained, even after accepting her competence, had completely disappeared. They spoke to her with the easy familiarity reserved for family members, sharing jokes, concerns, and personal stories they would never discuss with outsiders. Rodriguez, whose physical wounds were healing quickly, spent hours at Morrison's bedside and frequently sought out Sarah for updates on his friend's condition. During one of these conversations, he revealed something that surprised her. "Doc, I need to tell you something," Rodriguez said, glancing around to make sure they were alone. Morrison wasn't just hurt in that explosion. He threw himself on top of me when he saw the IED go off. He saved my life, and it nearly cost him his own. Sarah felt a chill as she understood the implication. Morrison's injuries were not just the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were the consequence of a deliberate act of heroism to protect a teammate. "Have you told him that you know?" she asked. Rodriguez shook his head. "He'd probably deny it. That's just who he is, always looking out for his guys." As Sarah continued treating Morrison and the other injured SEALs, she began to understand the depth of loyalty and sacrifice that defined their relationships with each other. These men formed bonds that went beyond professional teamwork or military duty. They were willing to die for each other, and that willingness created a level of trust and intimacy that few people ever experienced. However, this realization also made Sarah aware of her own growing emotional investment in their well-being. She had always maintained professional distance from her patients, but the unique environment of the combat zone and the extraordinary circumstances they all faced had made that distance increasingly difficult to maintain. One evening, while checking on Morrison's progress, she found herself fighting back tears of relief when he showed significant improvement. The reaction surprised her with its intensity, and she realized that somewhere along the way, these soldiers had stopped being just patients and had become people she genuinely cared about on a personal level. Chief Torres noticed her emotional response and approached her after Morrison had fallen asleep. "Doc, it's okay to care about us, right?" he said quietly. "We sure as hell care about you." His words were simple, but they carried profound meaning. Sarah understood that she had been accepted not just as a competent medical professional, but as a member of their extended military family. It was an honor that came with responsibilities she was still learning to understand, but also with rewards that made the dangers and hardships of deployment worthwhile. As she prepared her medical reports that night, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since her arrival at Forward Operating Base Alpha. She had come expecting to provide medical care in a challenging environment, but she had found something much more valuable, a sense of belonging and purpose that transcended her professional duties. The evening air hung heavy with dust and the lingering heat of another scorching Afghan day as Dr. Sarah Martinez sat alone in the medical facility, reviewing patient files by the light of a single lamp. Staff Sergeant Morrison had been transferred to a larger medical facility in Germany 3 days earlier, his condition stable enough for transport but still requiring extensive rehabilitation. The base felt strangely quiet without his presence, and Sarah found herself missing the steady stream of visitors who had kept vigil at his bedside. A soft knock on the door interrupted her paperwork. Chief Petty Officer Torres entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression Sarah had learned to recognize as his way of approaching serious conversations. Over the months since she had arrived at Forward Operating Base Alpha, Torres had become something of an unofficial liaison between the SEAL teams and the medical staff. "Thought you might need some caffeine," he said, setting one of the cups on her desk. "You've been putting in long hours lately?" Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, noting the concerned look in Torres's eyes. "Just catching up on paperwork. How's the team adjusting to Morrison's absence?" Torres settled into the chair across from her desk, his expression growing serious. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. The guys are struggling more than they're willing to admit. Rodriguez especially." Sarah had noticed Rodriguez's increasing isolation over the past few days. While Morrison was recovering, Rodriguez had maintained his usual outgoing personality, but since his friend's departure he had become withdrawn and uncommunicative. "Has he been sleeping?" "Not much," Torres replied. "He's been having nightmares about the explosion. Keeps saying it should have been him in that hospital bed instead of Morrison." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices outside the medical facility. Through the window, Sarah could see a group of soldiers gathered around Rodriguez, who appeared to be in a heated argument with someone from another unit. Even from a distance, it was clear that Rodriguez was extremely agitated. Torres immediately stood and headed for the door. "I better go deal with that before it gets worse." Sarah followed him outside, arriving just as Rodriguez shoved another soldier hard enough to send him stumbling backward. The confrontation had attracted a crowd, and she could see the situation was on the verge of escalating into a serious fight. "Rodriguez, stand down!" Torres commanded, positioning himself between the two soldiers. "He called Morrison a glory hound," Rodriguez shouted, his face flushed with anger. "Said he got what he deserved for showing off." Sarah could see that Rodriguez was not just angry but emotionally overwhelmed. His hands were shaking and there was a wild look in his eyes that suggested he was not entirely in control of his actions. She recognized the signs of acute stress reaction, possibly triggered by grief and guilt over Morrison's injuries. "Rodriguez, I need you to come with me right now," she said firmly, stepping into his line of sight. "That's not a request." For a moment, Rodriguez looked like he might refuse, but something in Sarah's tone penetrated his emotional haze. He allowed Torres and Sarah to guide him away from the crowd and into the medical facility. Though his breathing remained rapid and shallow, once inside, Sarah had Rodriguez sit on one of the examination tables while Torres stood nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. She could see that Rodriguez was struggling to maintain his composure, and she suspected that the confrontation outside had been building for days. "Tell me what's really going on," she said gently. "And don't give me the standard 'I'm fine' response." For several minutes, Rodriguez remained silent, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I keep seeing it happen over and over. Morrison throwing himself in front of me, the explosion, all that blood." Sarah pulled up a chair and sat facing him. "That's called intrusive imagery. It's a normal response to traumatic events, especially when someone you care about was hurt. But it's more than that," Rodriguez continued. "I keep thinking about what kind of person I am that I let him do it. I should have been the one protecting him, not the other way around." Torres moved closer, his expression showing both concern and understanding. "Rodriguez, Morrison made a split-second decision based on his training and instincts. You would have done the same thing for him, would I?" Rodriguez asked, looking up at both of them. "I keep wondering if I would have been brave enough to make that choice. What if I'm just a coward who hides behind other people's courage?" Sarah recognized that Rodriguez was experiencing what psychologists called moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when someone feels they have violated their own moral code or failed to live up to their values. It was a common issue among combat veterans, but rarely discussed openly. "Rodriguez, the fact that you're questioning your own courage shows how much you care about doing the right thing," she said. "Cowards don't worry about whether they're brave enough." Over the next hour, Sarah worked with Rodriguez to process his feelings about the explosion and Morrison's sacrifice. She taught him some basic techniques for managing intrusive thoughts and helped him understand that his Emotional reactions were normal responses to an abnormal situation. As they talked, Torres shared some of his own experiences with similar situations, describing times when he had been saved by teammates' actions and the guilt he had felt afterward. His willingness to be vulnerable encouraged Rodriguez to open up further about his fears and self-doubts. "The thing is," Rodriguez said toward the end of their conversation, "I joined the SEALs because I wanted to be the kind of person who protects others. But what if I'm not strong enough for that?" Sarah leaned forward, making sure she had his attention. "Rodriguez, strength isn't about being fearless or never needing help. It's about continuing to do your job even when you're scared, and being willing to seek support when you need it." As Rodriguez's emotional crisis subsided, Sarah found herself reflecting on her own journey at Forward Operating Base Alpha. When she had first arrived, she had focused primarily on treating physical injuries and proving her medical competence. But her work with Rodriguez and the other SEALs had shown her that healing often involved much more than repairing damaged tissue. The next morning, Rodriguez appeared at the medical facility looking better than he had in days. He thanked Sarah for their conversation and mentioned that he had actually managed to sleep through the night, for the first time since Morrison's departure. "Doc, can I ask you something?" he said as he was preparing to leave. "Of course. How do you do it? How do you stay strong enough to help all of us deal with our problems?" The question caught Sarah off guard, and she realized that Rodriguez was seeing her as more than just a medical professional. To him and the other SEALs, she had become a source of emotional strength and stability in an environment that offered very little of either. "Honestly, Rodriguez, I don't always feel strong," she admitted. "But I've learned that helping others often helps me find my own strength. Taking care of you guys gives me a sense of purpose that makes the difficult moments bearable." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. Maybe that's what Morrison was feeling when he protected me. Not that he had to be a hero, but that taking care of his team was just who he is." As Rodriguez left the medical facility, Sarah realized that their conversation had helped her understand something important about her own role at the base. She had originally seen her job as providing medical care to soldiers, but she had gradually become something more complex. A healer who addressed not just physical wounds but emotional and psychological injuries as well. The afternoon brought news that Morrison was showing excellent progress in his recovery and would likely be transferred to a rehabilitation facility in the United States within the week. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness at the news. She was thrilled that Morrison would recover fully, but she would miss having him as part of their tight-knit community. That evening, she joined several of the SEALs for dinner in the dining facility, something that had become a regular tradition. As they shared stories and jokes over their meal, Sarah marveled at the resilience of these remarkable men. Despite everything they had endured, the physical dangers, the psychological trauma, the loss of friends and teammates, they continued to find ways to support each other and maintain their humanity in an inhumane environment. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Alpha as Dr. Sarah Martinez made her final rounds through the medical facility. After 8 months in Afghanistan, she was scheduled to rotate back to the United States in just 3 days. The thought of leaving filled her with conflicting emotions. Excitement about returning home mixed with genuine sadness about leaving the people who had become her extended family. Chief Petty Officer Torres found her in the supply room, conducting a final inventory for her replacement. The new medic, Dr. James Patterson, had arrived the previous week and was in the process of familiarizing himself with the base's operations and personnel. Sarah had spent considerable time briefing Patterson on the unique needs of the SEAL teams, particularly their psychological care requirements. "Doc, the guys want to see you in the briefing room," Torres said, though something in his expression suggested this was not a routine meeting. Sarah followed Torres through the base, noting how familiar every building and pathway had become over the months. She had arrived as an outsider trying to prove herself worthy of trust, but she was leaving as someone who truly understood the rhythm and culture of this military community. When they entered the briefing room, Sarah was surprised to find both SEAL teams assembled. along with Colonel Williams and several other base personnel. Even more surprising was the presence of Staff Sergeant Morrison, who had arrived on the morning transport flight from Germany. He looked thinner than before his injury and walked with a slight limp, but his smile was the same warm expression Sarah remembered. "Morrison! What are you doing here?" Sarah exclaimed, genuinely shocked to see him. "Couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye properly," Morrison replied, approaching her with open arms for a hug. "Besides, I wanted to thank you in person for saving my life." Colonel Williams stepped forward, holding an official-looking document. "Dr. Martinez, it's my honor to present you with the Army Commendation Medal for exceptionally meritorious service during combat operations. Your courage in treating wounded personnel under enemy fire and your dedication to the psychological well-being of our Special Operations Forces has been exemplary." As the colonel read the official citation, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the recognition. She had simply done her job as she understood it. But apparently her efforts had been noticed and appreciated at levels far above the base command. Rodriguez, who had become one of her most frequent visitors over the past month, stepped forward next. "Doc, we also wanted to give you something from all of us," he said, handing her a small wooden plaque with the seal trident emblem carved into it. Sarah examined the plaque and noticed that all the team members had signed it, along with personal messages of thanks. At the bottom, someone had carved the words, "To our doc, who healed more than just our wounds." "This is beautiful," Sarah said, feeling tears forming in her eyes. "But you guys know I was just doing my job." Torres shook his head. "No, Doc, you did way more than that. You listened when we needed to talk, you understood what we were going through, and you never judged us for being human." Morrison moved closer, his expression serious. "Sarah, when I woke up in that hospital in Germany, the first thing I thought about was whether you knew that I was okay. You weren't just our medic, you became family." As the informal ceremony continued, various team members shared stories about how Sarah had helped them through difficult moments. Some spoke about physical injuries she had treated with exceptional skill, but most talked about the emotional support she had provided during their darkest hours. Petty Officer Wilson, a quiet man who rarely spoke in groups, surprised everyone by asking to say something. "Doc, when I lost my best friend in that ambush 6 months ago, I thought I was going to lose my mind. I was angry all the time, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on missions. You helped me understand that grieving didn't make me weak, and you taught me how to honor his memory without being destroyed by it." Sarah remembered that conversation well. Wilson had been on the verge of requesting a transfer out of Special Operations, convinced that his emotional reactions made him unfit for duty. Through several sessions, she had helped him understand that his grief was actually a testament to his capacity for loyalty and love, qualities that made him a better soldier. Not a worse one. Dr. Patterson, her replacement, had been observing the gathering with obvious interest. As the formal presentations concluded, he approached Sarah with questions about her approach to treating the psychological needs of Special Operations personnel. "I've read your medical reports," Patterson said, "but I'm curious about the informal counseling you've been providing. That's not typically part of a combat medic's duties." Sarah considered her response carefully. "Dr. Patterson, these men face situations that most people can't imagine. They see things and do things that create psychological wounds just as real as bullet wounds. If we only treat their physical injuries while ignoring their emotional trauma, we're not really healing them." Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "The SEAL team seemed to have developed an unusual level of trust in you. How did you build that relationship?" "I listened without judging," Sarah replied, "and I learned that being tough enough for Special Operations doesn't mean being immune to human emotion. These guys needed someone who understood that they could be both warriors and human beings." As the gathering began to break up, Morrison approached Sarah for a private conversation. They walked outside to a quiet area behind the medical facility, where they could talk without being overheard. "Sarah, I need to tell you something that I haven't told anyone else," Morrison said, his voice serious. When I threw myself in front of Rodriguez during that explosion, it wasn't just instinct or training. It was because of something you said to me weeks earlier. Sarah looked puzzled. What do you mean? Remember when I came to see you with that headache and you talked about how caring for others could be a source of strength rather than weakness? You said that protecting people we care about gives our lives meaning. Morrison paused, gathering his thoughts. In that split second before the explosion, I realized that protecting Rodriguez wasn't about being a hero, it was about honoring the bonds that make us human. Sarah felt a chill as she understood the implication of Morrison's words. Her conversations with the SEALs about emotional wellness and the importance of caring for each other had not just helped them psychologically, they had actually influenced life and death decisions in combat situations. Morrison, you would have made that same choice regardless of anything I said, she replied. That's just who you are. Maybe, Morrison acknowledged. But you helped me understand that it was okay to admit how much my teammates mean to me. And that understanding made me more willing to act on those feelings when it mattered most. As Sarah prepared to board the transport helicopter that would begin her journey home, she reflected on the unexpected ways her deployment had changed her own understanding of medicine and healing. She had arrived at Forward Operating Base Alpha with excellent technical skills and a desire to serve, but she was leaving with a deeper appreciation for the connection between physical and emotional wellness. The SEALs had taught her that true healing often required addressing invisible wounds that were just as debilitating as visible injuries. More importantly, they had shown her that acknowledging vulnerability and seeking help were not signs of weakness, but demonstrations of wisdom and strength. As the helicopter lifted off and the base grew smaller below her, Sarah could see the SEALs gathered on the landing zone, waving goodbye. She knew that her time with them had ended, but the lessons they had taught each other about courage, loyalty, and the healing power of human connection would continue to influence their lives long after her departure. Rodriguez had been right when he said she had healed more than just their wounds. But what he did not fully understand was how much they had healed her as well, teaching her that the practice of medicine was not just about applying technical knowledge, but about recognizing and nurturing the fundamental human need for understanding, acceptance, and care. The helicopter banked toward the east, carrying Sarah away from Forward Operating Base Alpha and toward home. But she knew that part of her would always remain with the extraordinary men who had trusted her not just with their lives, but with their deepest fears and hopes. In return, they had given her a new understanding of what it meant to be both a healer and a human being.